The morning air was crisp as he stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, just like every other morning since he retired. The birds chirped, the breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment, life was good. Then, she appeared. Marching across the neatly trimmed lawn like she owned it, a woman in a bright red blazer and oversized sunglasses stormed toward his front porch. Her expression was tight with anger, her arms crossed like a school principal about to scold a misbehaving student. "Excuse me," she barked, standing at the edge of his steps. "We need to talk." He sighed, setting his coffee down on the railing. He already knew who she was. He had seen her walking around the neighborhood, giving orders, scolding people for leaving their trash cans out for too long, and measuring grass with a ruler. She was the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association, the HOA Karen. But there was just one problem. He wasn't part of the HOA. "I don't think we do," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Oh, we do," she insisted, tapping her clipboard. "Your property is an eyesore. That little garden gnome by your driveway? Completely unacceptable. It does not match the neighborhood aesthetic." He looked over at the small ceramic gnome, a harmless decoration his grandkids had picked out for him. The thing wasn't hurting anybody. "You're joking, right?" he asked. Karen's lips pursed. "I do not joke about HOA regulations. If we let one person start decorating however they want, next thing you know, we'll have pink flamingos, tacky yard signs, and," she lowered her voice like she was about to say something scandalous, "lawn furniture." He laughed. "You do realize I'm not part of your HOA, right?" She flinched. For a second, her eyes darted across his porch, like she was checking to see if anyone else was listening. "That doesn't matter. This is a neighborhood standard. You can't just do whatever you want." "I can on my property." She stepped forward, one foot on the bottom step. "That's what you think," she said, her voice dripping with smugness. "I already spoke with the board. If you refuse to comply, we'll be forced to fine you." "Fine me?" He shook his head. "Lady, I don't answer to you." Her face turned a deep shade of red. "Oh, we'll see about that," she snapped. She pulled out her phone and dialed security. The retired man watched in disbelief as she reported him for noncompliance. She spoke loudly, making sure the neighbors who were now peeking out their windows heard everything. "I have a homeowner refusing to obey the regulations," she said, practically shouting into the phone. "He's getting aggressive, and I don't feel safe." His jaw dropped. Aggressive? He hadn't even raised his voice. Within minutes, a security vehicle pulled up, lights flashing. A uniformed officer stepped out, looking between them. "Is there a problem here?" Karen immediately launched into her performance, clutching her chest like she had just been through something traumatic. "Yes. He's refusing to remove the violation from his yard, and now he's trying to intimidate me. He threatened me." The officer turned to the man. "Sir, I need you to step away from the property." He stared in shock. Step away from his own home? "Hold on," he said, his voice firm now. "This is my house. My property. I haven't done a thing wrong." Karen folded her arms. "Actually, he's trespassing." The crowd of neighbors gasped. The retired man couldn't believe what he was hearing. How had things escalated this far? And more importantly, how was he going to get out of this? Just a few months ago, he had stood in front of this very house, staring up at it with a sense of peace. It wasn't a mansion, not even the biggest house on the street, but it was his. A quiet, cozy home where he could finally enjoy his retirement. After years of hard work, he had bought the house outside of the HOA's jurisdiction on purpose. He had heard horror stories about HOA rules, how they controlled everything from fence height to mailbox color. He wanted none of that nonsense. He just wanted to sit on his porch, enjoy his coffee, and live life at his own pace. For the first few weeks, it had been perfect. The neighborhood was clean, the houses well kept, and he even made small talk with a few of the other homeowners. Some were friendly, but most kept their heads down. He figured that was just how things were. But then, he met her. The first time Karen showed up, it had been under the pretense of a friendly visit. She had knocked on his door, clipboard in hand, and introduced herself as the head of the local homeowners association. "Oh, I'm not in the HOA," he had told her with a polite smile. Karen's eyes had narrowed just a little. "Not yet," she had said, her tone too sugary. "But you'll see. It's so much easier to just follow the rules. Keeps the neighborhood looking nice, you know?" At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. He had simply nodded, thanked her for stopping by, and closed the door. But Karen wasn't done with him. First, it was little things. She started reminding him about neighborhood standards. She suggested he repaint his mailbox, even though there was nothing wrong with it. She said he should trim his hedges a certain way, just like the rest of the street. Then, it got worse. One day, he came home to find a bright orange violation notice taped to his door. At first, he thought it was a mistake, until he read the fine print. "Your property does not comply with HOA regulations. Please remove all unapproved decorations within 48 hours to avoid further action." He actually laughed out loud. There was no way this was real. He wasn't in the HOA. He tossed the notice in the trash and went about his day. But the next morning, there was another one. And another. Karen had doubled down. One evening, as he was bringing in his trash bins, Karen appeared again, standing on the sidewalk with her ever-present clipboard. "I've been trying to be patient," she said, sighing dramatically. "But you're making things difficult." He frowned. "Lady, I don't know what your problem is, but I live outside the HOA. You can't fine me, you can't make me follow your rules, and you sure as heck can't tell me what I can and can't do on my own land." She pursed her lips. "You think you're special, don't you? That you're above the rest of us?" "I think I own my home, and you have no authority over it," he shot back. Karen's eyes flashed with something that almost looked like excitement, like she enjoyed the challenge. "Well, we'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel and striding away. At the time, he had assumed that was the end of it. He had been wrong. Because a few days later, he caught her trespassing on his property. And that was when he knew. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was personal. He had seen plenty of HOA horror stories before, but this was something else. It was early morning when he spotted her, Karen, standing on his lawn, clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. She was measuring his mailbox. He set his coffee down slowly, took a deep breath, and stepped off his porch. "Can I help you?" he called. Karen didn't even flinch. She scribbled something onto her clipboard and muttered, "You've been warned about this." "Warned about what?" She finally turned to face him, her expression filled with fake patience. "Your mailbox is 2 inches taller than the neighborhood standard." His eye twitched. "I don't follow HOA rules. I've told you this." She sighed dramatically, as if explaining something to a child. "I understand your confusion, but you're part of the neighborhood. And the neighborhood has standards. No, what I have is property rights. You don't control my house, my mailbox, or my land." Karen's face tightened. She glanced around, noticing a few neighbors peeking from their windows. Then, as if flipping a switch, she smiled. "All right," she said sweetly. "If you're going to be difficult, I'll just escalate things." With that, she ripped another violation notice from her clipboard and slammed it against his mailbox. He ripped it right back off. "Lady, I'm telling you, this needs to stop." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, I think we're just getting started." And then, she walked straight up his porch steps. His patience snapped. "Get off my property." But she didn't stop. She started pointing at his decorations, his potted plants, even the way his porch chairs were arranged. "None of this is approved. None of this meets neighborhood standards. If you'd just join the HOA, things would be a lot easier for you. He took a step closer, blocking her path. I said, "Get off my property." For a moment, just a moment, he saw something flash in her eyes, fear. But then it was gone, replaced by smug satisfaction. "Fine," she said, stepping back dramatically, looking around as if expecting witnesses. "I'll go. But let me just say, if you don't want to listen to me, maybe you'll listen to law enforcement." His stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer. She just turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing there, fists clenched. A few hours later, he found out exactly what she meant. Because that afternoon, a police officer knocked on his door. The knock on the door was firm, authoritative. The kind of knock that made people nervous. He sighed, setting down his coffee, and opened the door. A uniformed police officer stood there, arms crossed. Behind him, Karen stood a few feet away on the sidewalk, arms folded smugly. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said. "We received a complaint about a disturbance on this property." His eyes narrowed. "A disturbance?" The officer glanced at his notepad. "According to the report, you were aggressive with a neighborhood official and made threatening remarks." His blood pressure spiked. "That's a lie. I asked her to get off my property after she trespassed, again." Karen gasped dramatically from behind the officer. "That's not true. I was simply explaining our community's rules, and he shouted at me." He was very intimidating. The officer looked at him again. "Sir, do you have any security cameras?" A slow grin spread across his face. "As a matter of fact," he said, turning to point at the small camera mounted above his front door, "I do." Karen's smug expression vanished. "Oh, she stammered, "that won't be necessary. I was just trying to." "Actually," he said, pulling out his phone, "I'd love to show the footage." It only took 30 seconds of playback for the officer's entire demeanor to shift. The video clearly showed Karen trespassing, ignoring his warnings, and then threatening to call the police on him for simply standing his ground. The officer's jaw tightened. He slowly turned to face Karen. "Ma'am, you didn't mention that you were on his property without permission." Karen's eyes darted around. "Well, I thought it was a neighborhood issue, so I didn't think." "That's not how it works," the officer interrupted. "You can't file false complaints. That's a serious offense." Her face drained of color. She stammered, "I wasn't trying to file a false complaint. I was just." The officer held up a hand, silencing her. Then he turned back to the man. "Sir, would you like to press charges for trespassing and filing a false report?" For a moment, he considered it. It would be so satisfying to finally teach her a lesson. But then he glanced around and saw the neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, watching the scene unfold. Some looked amused. Others looked relieved. And suddenly, he realized something. Karen had been doing this for years. He wasn't the first person she had harassed, just the first one to fight back. A slow smile spread across his face. "No, I won't press charges." Karen let out a relieved breath. "But," he added, crossing his arms, "I think a formal complaint against her and the HOA board is in order. I'd hate for someone else to go through this nonsense." The officer nodded. "That's fair." He turned to Karen, who looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you leave this man alone before things escalate further." Karen stormed away without another word. But he knew this wasn't over. She wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. And he was ready for her. For the next few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Karen had disappeared. No knocks on the door, no fake violation notices, no friendly reminders about HOA rules. He knew better than to think she had given up. She was just waiting. And then, one morning, he saw it. A certified letter from the HOA, taped to his mailbox. He pulled it off and unfolded the crisp paper. The letter was filled with legal jargon, but one sentence stood out. You are hereby required to remove all unapproved property violations or face further action. Failure to comply may result in legal proceedings. His fists clenched. Karen was still trying. Even after getting caught lying to the police, even after being exposed, she was doubling down. She wanted a fight? She was about to get one. Gathering evidence. Instead of reacting immediately, he did something smarter. He went online and started researching HOA laws in his state. He read up on property rights, boundary laws, and cases of HOAs overstepping their authority. The more he read, the more confident he became. Karen wasn't just overstepping, she was violating the law. Next, he went around the neighborhood, talking to other homeowners. He started with small talk, asking about the HOA, if they'd had any issues. At first, people were hesitant. Karen had been running things for years, and most homeowners feared retaliation. But then, one of the older couples opened up. She threatened to fine us for having too many flowers in our garden, the elderly woman whispered. We were scared to fight back, so we just removed them. A younger man nodded. She charged me a parking violation for leaving my own truck in my driveway overnight. More and more stories came out. People weren't just annoyed with Karen. They were sick of her. He documented everything. He gathered written statements, past violation notices, and even a few security camera clips from other homeowners who had caught Karen harassing them. By the end of the week, he had a stack of evidence against her. It was time to make his move. The warning. That evening, he printed out a copy of his property deed and highlighted the section that clearly stated, "This residence is not under HOA jurisdiction." He made 2 copies, one for himself and one for the HOA board. Then, he typed up an official response to the HOA's letter, citing state property laws, harassment laws, and legal cases where homeowners had sued their HOAs for overreach, and won. The next morning, he walked straight to the HOA office and handed everything to the receptionist. "Please make sure Karen gets this," he said with a smile. She nodded, flipping through the documents. When she saw what they contained, her eyes widened. "Oh, wow." He gave her a polite nod and walked out. Now, it was a waiting game. Would Karen back off? Or would she make the biggest mistake of her life? For 2 days, there was nothing. No letters, no phone calls, no Karen. Then, on the 3rd day, he got a notice. This one wasn't taped to his mailbox. It wasn't shoved in his door. It was hand-delivered by Karen herself. He opened the door to find her standing there, her red blazer buttoned up tight, her sunglasses perched on her nose. But this time, her usual smugness was gone. She was nervous. "I'm here to inform you that the HOA board has reviewed your documents," she said, her voice clipped, "and we have decided that, in this one instance, we will make an exception." He smiled. An exception? For what? Karen hesitated, shifting her weight. "You will not be required to remove your property violations." He crossed his arms. "You mean you can't make me do it, because you have no authority over my property?" Her nostrils flared, but she forced a smile. "Well, we just don't want any trouble." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because I don't want trouble either." For a brief moment, Karen looked relieved. But then, he pulled another stack of papers from his pocket and held them up. Her eyes darted to them. "What's that?" "Oh, just a little collection of stories from the neighbors," he said casually. "Turns out, a lot of people have complaints about you, Karen. Overcharges. False fines. Unauthorized towing. Harassment." Karen froze. "You've been running this HOA like it's your own little kingdom," he continued. "But people are sick of it. And guess what? Some of them are ready to take this to a lawyer." Her face paled. "They wouldn't." "They would." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely afraid. He stepped closer. I suggest you start treating people with a little more respect. Because if this keeps up, you won't just lose your HOA position. You'll be looking at legal trouble. Karen didn't say a word. She snatched the notice back from his hand and stormed off. But it was too late. Because the very next day, the entire neighborhood found out the truth. The HOA meeting that changed everything. A week later, a special HOA meeting was called. Word had spread fast, faster than Karen could control it. The room was packed. Homeowners who usually never attended came just to see what would happen. Karen sat at the front, trying to maintain her usual air of superiority, but she looked uncomfortable. When the meeting started, he stood up. I'd like to address something, he said, stepping forward. He pulled out his documents and read aloud some of the complaints he had gathered from homeowners. One by one, people spoke up. She fined me for having a garden hose visible in my yard. She charged me twice for a trash can violation that never happened. She threatened to have my car towed from my own driveway. More and more voices joined in. Karen's face turned redder and redder. Then, the real bomb dropped. A man stood up and held up his own stack of papers. I contacted a lawyer, he announced. And guess what? This HOA has been charging illegal fees for years. Gasps rippled through the room. People turned to Karen. She was cornered. She tried to defend herself. She tried to say it was all misunderstandings. But the HOA board members, the ones who had blindly supported her before, were now distancing themselves from her. And finally, after years of her bullying and control, someone on the board said the words. I think it's time we vote for a new HOA president. Karen's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to protest, but no one wanted to hear it. The vote was cast. And just like that, Karen was removed. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter. People smiled. They shook his hand, thanking him for standing up. And as he walked home, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. But Karen wasn't done just yet. Because the next day, she tried to retaliate. And that was her biggest mistake of all. For most people, getting publicly voted out of their HOA presidency would be enough of a wake-up call. But not Karen. No, she wasn't the type to accept defeat. And the next morning, he woke up to find a tow truck parked in front of his driveway. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, clipboard in hand. Morning, the man said. Here to tow the vehicle. He blinked. Tow what vehicle? The man jabbed a thumb toward his own truck, parked in his driveway. Says here it's a violation of neighborhood standards. His stomach twisted. Karen. She was making one final attempt to show she was still in control. The man held out a form. Gotta take it unless you've got some paperwork saying otherwise. A slow grin spread across his face. Oh, I've got paperwork. He turned, walked inside, and came back with a folder full of documents. I think you'll want to look at these. The man took the papers, his brows furrowing. Within seconds, his expression changed. This says the HOA has no jurisdiction over your property. That's right. He nodded. And this, he tapped another paper, says that anyone towing a vehicle from private property without authorization is committing a crime. The tow truck driver gulped. He muttered, glancing back at his truck. You know what? I think this is a misunderstanding. I'll just be on my way. He didn't wait for an answer. He jumped back into his truck, threw it into reverse, and sped off. Karen, watching from across the street, looked stunned. He turned to her and grinned. That's strike 3, Karen. Her face twisted in rage. You think you're so clever, she hissed. You just ruined this neighborhood. He laughed. No, I just ruined your little kingdom. And that's when she snapped. Karen's last mistake. Karen marched straight across the street, onto his property, again. She was ranting, pointing, yelling about how she would take this to court. How she would make sure he regretted this. And then, she made her biggest mistake yet. She reached up and grabbed his security camera. With a single yank, she ripped it off the wall. For a second, there was silence. Then, she realized what she had just done. She had just destroyed private property. On camera. Because, of course, he had another security camera pointed at the first one. Her face went pale. She stammered, her hands shaking. You can't. Oh, but I can, he said, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen and played the footage back. Crystal clear, 1080p footage of Karen committing vandalism. She took a step back. Wait. Let's talk about this. He smiled. No need. Then, he dialed the police. The final reckoning. The officers arrived fast. This time, Karen didn't have her usual smugness. She didn't try to twist the story. Because she knew she was caught. The officers watched the footage. They asked him if he wanted to press charges. And this time? He said yes. Karen was arrested for vandalism and trespassing. As she was led away in handcuffs, the entire neighborhood watched. No one defended her. No one spoke up. Because the truth was finally out. She had spent years bullying people, thinking she was untouchable. But in the end? She had destroyed herself. The lesson. With Karen gone, the neighborhood changed overnight. The HOA restructured, removing unfair rules and getting rid of Karen's ridiculous fines. Homeowners finally felt free again. And him? He finally got to enjoy his retirement in peace. He sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise. And in his front yard, standing proudly, was the same garden gnome Karen had tried so hard to remove. Some fights weren't worth having. But some? Some were worth winning.